Hey, it's NPR's Book of the Day. I'm Andrew Limbong. Returning to a creative project after lots and lots of time can be weird and scary and kind of embarrassing. You couldn't pay me to listen to some of my earliest pieces for NPR. But with time, sometimes comes a better understanding of what you were trying to accomplish. Author Vauhini Vara's new short story collection, This Is Salvaged, has material going back to 2008, when she was in her mid-20s. And she talked to Here and Now's Deepa Fernandes about how the big changes in her life since then influenced her writing. That's after the break.
This message comes from Apple. Apple Gift Card is a practical gift that unlocks a world of entertainment and fun. You can send it via email or give a physical card to your loved ones, friends, or family. They can use Apple Gift Card to buy Apple products, accessories, apps, and games. But they can also use the funds to pay for music, movies, TV shows, and more. Visit apple.com for details and to send Apple Gift Cards to your friends and family this holiday season.
Vauhini Vara's debut novel, The Immortal King Rao, wove climate change, capitalism, and genetic manipulation into a sweeping family saga. The book was a finalist for this year's Pulitzer Prize. Her follow-up book goes in a much more intimate direction. Vara's beautiful new collection of short stories takes us into the lives of women and girls who often struggle to connect and communicate. The book is called This Is Salvaged, and Vauhini Vara joins me now to talk about it. Vauhini, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I'd love to start by asking you about your process of writing a book of short stories, which I have to say, compared to your novel, I don't know, maybe is a tad harder. A novel seems like you follow the same characters on one longer path, but you've come up with such an array of stories. All these characters are so different from each other. How do you conceive of a story and then bring it to fruition?
So often for me, a story will start with some situation, maybe a situation I've been in or somebody I know has been in. And then I think about what it would be like to sort of dial that up to 11, and make the situation sort of the most tense or awkward or upsetting. These stories in the collection, I started the first one in the collection in 2008, and we're in 2023 now. So that was 15 years ago. I was in my 20s then. And a funny thing that happened with the stories is that there are some characters who are parents, there's some characters who are little kids. And I aged from, my mid-20s to my early 40s while working on the collection. And so the perspective that I as a human have sort of ended up shifting the stories as I worked on them over time, which is a really odd experience.
So there are stories in here about parents and parenting. And I wonder if you just talk about how that changed a little bit. I mean, I'm thinking of one particular story where a mother withholds information about her daughter's father. It was so nuanced. I felt so strongly for both characters. Talk about writing that story as a parent yourself.
That's an example of a story that I started when I was in my 20s. I was so far from being a mother at that time. And I took a stab at, I think I was in this phase in my life being a kid in my 20s where I wanted to see what it would be like as a writing exercise to sort of write from outside of my own perspective. And so I wrote this character who's a mother who is an Indian immigrant to the US and a mother of a teenager. And I remember my mentor, Sam Chang, the director of the Iowa Writers Workshop, reading it and saying to me, I don't know that I buy that this character knows anything about motherhood, which isn't to say I think that a non-parent shouldn't write about parenting. I think we can all write about whatever. But I think I didn't yet have the capacity, I think, to imagine or understand what that would be like. And so I kept working at it. And the moment at which that story sort of unlocked itself was becoming a parent myself and sort of understanding on a visceral level what that feels like and what it means. Becoming a parent allowed me to make real what to me still seemed kind of hypothetical or imaginary when I started writing that story.
I was also struck about the stories in there about sisters. You had a whole story about one sister receiving a visitor from her younger sister and family that was rife with so much, judgment from one sister to the other. And in another story, a character talks about her very righteous and judgmental sister. And sister relationships are so complicated. I'm wondering why you chose to show this kind of fraught side of sisterhood.
So my sister passed away when I was in college, and she was in college as well. And that was my freshman year of college. And then my sophomore year of college, I came back to school and I took my first creative writing class, and essentially was just like writing stories about my sister. That was all I was capable of writing at that point, because I was going through grief over the loss of my sister. And I think for me, that has ended up sort of like becoming part of my DNA as a writer, like sisterhood, female relationships, loss of close female relationships has become something that's sort of inextricable for me from my writing.
Yeah, I mean, that also makes me think there is death and loss and grief in so many of these stories. You know, in the first story, one of the teenage girls loses her older brother. I wonder if your own experience leads you, and I don't mean this flippantly, Vauhini, that death actually is something that a lot of people have to deal with and still go on with life.
Yeah, my background is as a reporter, as a journalist. And I think there are things for me that are really difficult to write about in a sort of like journalistic form, right? And I think I turn to fiction to write about the things that are sort of unknowable or inexplicable. And for me, I think for a lot of us, death is one of those. And so I find that like grief and loss and the inexplicable aspects of it find their way into my fiction a lot.
Yeah. I want to ask you a kind of a different question, because in one of the stories where there are two mums who've just moved to a new place, in the case in this story, it's Iowa City. They find each other online. They decide to meet up as a coffee shop as the two newbies looking for friends. You seem to have these deep observations of what seemed to me like a cross-class friendship that was percolating. And it's something I don't think we see depicted much in pop culture or even in literature. And I want you to talk about that story and why you chose to situate these two characters as potential friends.
I don't know if you find this, but I find that sometimes in fiction within communities of color, written from within communities of color, I'm Indian American, for example, the stories are sort of like about that particular community. And in reality, at least in my experience, like when you're a person of color, like you're not just interacting with people from within your small community, you're interacting with people from all kinds of backgrounds. And so I was interested in sort of like the nuance of what relationships across race, across class look like. I have friends from all kinds of different racial backgrounds, class backgrounds, and that does like affect the way the relationship builds. It can be a source of conflict in relationships, and I think there's a lot of richness there to be mined in creative work. And I feel like I don't read as much about those kinds of relationships as I'd like to.
No,
so
not at all, which is what I so appreciated about the story. And yes, there was a lot to relate to there. So the stories, they're very intimate about relationships and personal relationships. But one story, and it's the title story, This Is Salvaged, it also took on some really big things that we're all dealing with, the crisis of the unhoused, of homelessness, and also climate change. And you brought them together in a way where they were the backdrop to the story, making us confront them. But this was still a story about intimate personal relationships. So I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about what you were trying to do with the story This Is Salvaged.
So this is a story about an artist, a male artist, a rare story about a male protagonist in the collection who is a kind of installation artist and decides he wants to build an ark like Noah's Ark according to the proportions of the Bible. I think looking back on it, I can see it as a kind of metaphor for my own questions and struggles as an artist, as a writer, interested in these big problems and challenges of our time, in climate change, in capitalism, and thinking about what an artist can possibly do about these things or how an artist can relate to them. Even though this character looks the least like me, he's a white man, I think I sort of put some of these concerns and insecurities and questions of mine in this character who decides that like the way as an artist to quote unquote do something about climate change, about homelessness, is to build an ark and enlist homeless people to help him build it and pay them. it doesn't go that well. I don't know what that says about me as a writer, but that's fiction.
The truth, maybe, is that it's really hard to solve some of these really big problems.
Absolutely.
The stories, there are some themes that link them, but they're also quite different from each other. What did you want readers to come away with?
I think I wanted readers to get a sense of being inside these relationships in which people really wanted to connect with one another and sometimes failed and then still kept trying. I think that's something that's very common to our human experience. And I think that's what's present in a lot of these stories.
Vauhini Vara's new collection of short stories, This Is Salvaged. It was a wonderful read. Thank you so much, Vauhini, for joining us.
Thank you again, Deepa.
It's been a great year for TV, movies, and music, and we are highlighting the best of the best. We're talking about our favorite moments of the year, including some of the best pop culture you might have missed. Listen now to the Pop Culture Happy Hour podcast from NPR.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from South Carolina Federal Credit Union. Owning a home is still possible if you ask the right people, like the home loan advisors at South Carolina Federal Credit Union. You could be closer to owning a home than you think with options like no money down and adjustable rate mortgages. Rely on South Carolina Federal for guidance through every step of the home loan process. Learn more at scfederal.org/home loans. Qualifications and restrictions apply. Equal housing lender. Support for this podcast and the following message come from South Carolina Federal Credit Union. Folks listening to this in a vehicle they're tired of owning are in luck. South Carolina Federal provides auto loans that could help reduce the costs of commutes and road trips. And there's no payment due for 90 days after closing. To learn more about how fast, friendly financing can get drivers behind the wheel and out on the road, visit scfederal.org. Loans subject to approval. Certain restrictions apply.